Hey film fans, what's going on in this scene?
A guy named Joe Gillis called and he said he wants you to meet him at the St. James Club around 10 o'clock on the patio. Know who this is?
Joe Gillis, never heard of him.
He said you'd know.
Anybody know who Joe Gillis is?
He's the character William Holden played in Sunset Boulevard, the writer who gets killed by the movie star.
Gloria Swanson.
That is fantastic.
All I know.
Let's find out more as we wrap up this mini-series on the seedy side of Hollywood by considering this 1992 satire, thriller, dark comedy, The Player, on this episode of What Makes This Film Great. Player is a 1992 film distributed by Fine Line Features. It was directed by Robert Altman from a script by Michael Tolkien, and it has cinematography by Jean Le Pen. The editor was Geraldine Perroni. There's music by Thomas Newman, who scored like half the films of the 90s, I think, and on. The production design is by Stephen Altman and Ken Kaufman. And the cast includes Tim Robbins, Greta Scacchi, Fred Ward, Whoopi Goldberg, Lyle Lovett, Cynthia Stephens, and everyone in Hollywood. I mention all of them because, well, as I often do in these videos, again, all of their work together kind of creates the magic of what this film is. In the case of Altman, this is often referred to as his comeback film. Probably most of you watching this channel already know, although some of you might not, that Altman was one of the big, heavy sort of auteur directors of the 1970s. He'd been making films since the 60s, but he really landed with his 1970 film MASH, and this was a huge hit, and it was a huge new Hollywood hit. It was quirky, it was anti-establishment, it was comedic and yet also darkly cynical. It's the first Hollywood film, at least the first one that I know of, that uses the F word in the film. Followed shortly after by Hal Ashby's The Landlord. And it made stars out of Elliot Gould and Donald Sutherland, who were already rising stars, among many other people. And after that, Altman, he never quite had that much success again financially, but critically, he was a darling of the 1970s. And he directed some of the sort of key films of that era, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Nashville, The Long Goodbye, and many more. And he was kind of a darling of 70s New Hollywood film. People wanted to work with him. He was known as a great actor's director. He was technologically innovative. He was the first director to use body mics, and Altman was a friend of many people in the music business, like a lot of the directors in the 70s were. And he saw that in the music industry in the early 70s, at that point, they were using 8-track recording, so they could record 8 separate tracks. Soon after that, it would be 1632 and more, and today it's almost infinite with digital recording. But Altman had the idea, why couldn't we do that with filming? And it was something he was trying to do earlier. If you watch McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Altman's trying to do some really interesting things with sound in that film, but the technology hadn't caught up yet. So the sound is actually quite murky in a lot of spots, because one of the things Altman loved was to have overlapping dialogue. He believed that in real life, people don't just talk and then stop so the other person can respond. People talk over each other. There's people talking in the background. If you're at a party or at a dinner and there's several people at the table, different conversations are going on at the same time. And he wanted to feature that kind of naturalistic or realistic dialogue. In McCabe and Mrs. Miller, the effect, if you listen closely, it's very important because you hear different strains of sort of narrative development. But if you're just watching the film, it can sound like a kind of a wash of sound. But he got it figured out certainly by a film like Nashville, where the overlapping dialogue becomes a very important part of the film style. And he would continue to use that, and brilliantly in one of his late films from the 1990s, Gosford Park, where the dialogue is coming from all kinds of places in the house, because he had mastered this technique. And he would use up to 7 body mics and then a boom mic to get room sound. So He was known as a great stylist, he was known as a great storyteller, he was known as a great actress director, and he was known as sort of technologically astute, let's say. And then, like many of these great filmmakers of the 70s, he kind of had a falling off in the 80s. Sometimes this is overstated. Altman remained productive and active throughout the 80s. He continued to direct films, not as many. In the 70s, it was like a new Altman film's coming out every year. Not as many, but some films that have become, you know, over time, quite critically well respected, like Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean. Early in the 80s, he made his film Popeye, which, even though it made money, was considered a sort of bomb or a lukewarm success, let's say, but which has come to be much better thought of in the last 40 years. He also made this great sort of television miniseries called Tanner 88. That's kind of like a mockumentary presidential run, and that started to garner him more sort of critical respect, but also industry respect. And then he made a film about Vincent van Gogh and his brother Vincent and Theo, and the combination of this persistence, the combination of the sort of indie film starting to come back into sort of widespread attention in the early 90s, led to him getting this minor studio deal, but deal nonetheless, to make The Player in 1992. And it was a huge hit. It was a financial success, relatively speaking. It was a critical success, and it led to a kind of a renaissance that lasted throughout the rest of Altman's career. And he had a fabulous 90s and early to mid 2000s before he passed away. So even though I think it's sometimes overstated how bad the 80s were for him, The Player certainly, you know, elevated him back to the upper echelon of, you know, not blockbuster filmmakers, but sort of mainstream art, mainstream indie filmmakers in the United States. A lot of the people on the film had also worked with Altman before and would work with him again throughout this sort of 90s renaissance, including Le Pen, the cinematographer, and Peroni, the editor, his son, Stephen Altman, who did a lot of production design on his 90s films, and so on. And so he had this kind of cadre of people, which he'd done in the 70s as well. And because he was known as an actress-director, and because he had directed so many of the great new Hollywood actors of the 1970s, they're all in this film. Earlier, when I said everyone in Hollywood, I was kind of half joking, but part of what makes this film work so well, part of its kind of realism or verisimilitude, is that as a Hollywood film, more so than Cecil B. DeMille showing up or Buster Keaton showing up in Sunset Boulevard, like all of Hollywood, it feels like, is in this film. There are moments in the film where there are red carpet scenes. There are moments in the film where there are kind of Hollywood benefit dinners. And Altman populates these with real Hollywood actors playing themselves. Everyone from John Cusack, who was kind of an up-and-coming indie darling at the time, to Cher, who was a huge star, to Malcolm McDowell, to Bruce Reynolds, to Susan Sarandon, to Bruce Willis, Julia Roberts, like a who's who of 90s actors, but also a lot of the actors from the 70s who'd been in Altman films. Lily Tomlin, Scott Glenn, Karen Black shows up. It's just kind of a who's who of 70s and then kind of 90s with some 80s thrown in actors. And so as you're watching the film, which is set amongst the movie making industry in Hollywood, it feels real. And it feels real in a lot of other ways as well, which I want to talk about. Before we get into the story, I just want to say a little bit about the film's style, because it's wonderful. It's part of the fun of watching the movie, is watching this movie that's made with such love for movies. I said at the top that this is a satire, and one of the things that it's a satire about is Altman's belief, and he was not alone in this, that the movie industry had become too money focused, and Hollywood had always been money focused, so let's not pretend otherwise. But there was this era in the 70s, of which Altman was a big part, where it seemed like briefly, art mattered more. And I've done a whole series on this called The Rise and Fall of New Hollywood. There's a playlist you can see right here. And then the age of the blockbuster came about, and it's an overstatement, but it kind of killed that independent, artistic Hollywood environment that had, flourished so much in the 70s. And so in part, The Player is a satire of that mentality, right? That the only thing that really matters is how much money does the movie make. Not how good it is, not who's in it, not who's not in it, not who writes it.
No stars on this project. We're going out on a limb on this one.
Like unknown stage actors, or maybe somebody English, like what's his name?
Why? Why?
Part of what makes that work so much is, as I've mentioned, that you keep seeing all of these Hollywood people everywhere, but also in the production design, the mise-en-scène is full of nods to old Hollywood. It's full of nods to the movies in general. It's full of references, like I started off with, the reference to Sunset Boulevard, another seedy, dark satire about Hollywood. And it's full of references to foreign films. The Bicycle Thief plays a big, important part in this film, the Italian neo-realist film from the 1940s. So it's a movie that in many ways lives and breathes movies, and it's not just creating a verisimilitude or a realism. Oftentimes, these movie artifacts, the posters, the slogans, the sets that we see, people making movies, they're commenting in sly and subtle ways on the movie that we're actually watching. So in that scene that I started with, where there's the reference to Sunset Boulevard, this is a crime film about a writer who wants to do murder and about a writer who gets murdered. So there's a reference there to Sunset Boulevard, but also what's the difference between how it happened in Sunset Boulevard and how it happens in The Player? And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So all of these references that we see, that we hear, that sort of subsume us into the world of the film are there to create a sense that we're in a movie world, but also to continually poke and prod at that movie world as we're experiencing it. The cinematography works the same way. It's best known perhaps for its opening 7.5-minute tracking shot, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But the cinematography throughout the film is very important because it creates a vibe of surveillance. It creates a vibe that everybody is always watching or being watched. And that folds into the idea of watching movies. As you watch a film, you're kind of peering into people's lives. And this isn't anything new that I'm saying. This is an old observation or a theoretical model for understanding films and the sort of voyeuristic thrill of watching these people's lives unfold before our eyes when they can't see us, right? And the editing does very interesting things where it makes noticeable cuts that allow for one scene and the following scene to kind of comment on each other in ways that, again, fuel or prod at or poke or unpack the narrative. So as I talk a little bit about the story, I'll show you examples of all of those things, the mise-en-scène, the cinematography, and editing, and how they kind of work both to create this movie world, but also to pick at this movie world. So what's it all about? Tim Robbins plays Griffin Mill. He's a studio executive at a kind of unnamed studio in Hollywood, but it's meant to be kind of one of the big ones. We hear talk about Fox and Paramount and Columbia, and I think Universal, so it's not one of those, but it's meant to kind of replicate one of the big late 80s, early 90s studios. And he's a producer who's kind of second in command at the studio right now, and his position is a very important part of the film. And he hears story pitches all day, and he greenlights movies and then produces him. So he's one of the kind of gatekeepers of Hollywood filmmaking. And one of the things that sets The Player apart from the previous two films is where The Day of the Locust and Sunset Boulevard looked at the seedy side of Hollywood from the outside, from those trying to get in, or with one foot or even less, maybe a toe in the door. The Player shows it from the other side, The Player is about the heartlessness of the inside of Hollywood. And it's not seedy or seamy or scuzzy on the surface. You know, they all have the finest food, the finest cars. Tim Robbins' Griffin orders a different kind of mineral water at every restaurant or event he goes to, and he always knows, it's a running joke in the film, he always knows which mineral water to order at this establishment. So it's not scummy on its surface, but these are scummy people, always with a knife behind the back, ready to stab you no matter who you are, their best friend or lover or anyone else in between. And this is the world that we're moving through. And Griffin is this high-powered executive, and as the film opens, he's hearing pitches. Comedically, one of the first pitches we hear him hear is from Buck Henry, the great sort of New Hollywood screenwriter who wrote The Graduate, and he's pitching Griffin this.
What do you got for me?
Okay, here it is. The Graduate, Part 2.
Oh, good.
Now listen, the three principals are still with us. Dustin Hoffman, Anne Bancroft, Catherine Ross. 25 years later. And so are the characters. Ben, Elaine, and Mrs. Robinson. Ben and Elaine are married. Still, they live in a big, old, spooky house up in Northern California somewhere. And Mrs. Robinson lives with them. Her aging mother, who's had a stroke.
Mrs. Robinson has a stroke?
Robinson has a stroke, so she can't talk.
It's going to be funny?
Yeah, it'll be funny.
With a
Dark
stroke?
and weird and funny and with a stroke.
Okay.
There's like multiple layers of inside jokes going on there, but part of it was, at the time, people were wondering, should we make a sequel of The Graduate? And so the film takes this talk about sequels, and there's a lot in the film about sort of IP filmmaking, which you know, is the world we live in today. And it was very prescient in recognizing that that was, well, it was already there, but it was coming. And anyway, it takes this joke about should we make a sequel of The Graduate, and has the writer of The Graduate pitching it, and that's the sort of comedy there. Griffin's dating Cynthia Stevenson's Bonnie, and she's a story editor, and they have this lovely relationship, and they go to parties, and they're young, and they're beautiful, and everything seems good for him, except for two things. People keep talking about this guy named Larry Levy, and we don't meet Larry Levy for a while in the film, but even in that opening tracking shot, we hear people saying things like,
Oh, Larry Levy?
Maybe Larry Levy.
right, so Larry Levy's this presence. He's kind of like this phantom haunting the early parts of the film, and he's a hotshot, up-and-coming executive at another studio, and all the scuttlebutt is that he's coming to this one and is maybe a threat to Griffin's job, Griffin's position, Griffin's hope to one day run the studio. So this is part of the drama early on, but for much of the first act anyway, it's kind of in the background, even when Levy shows up. The second interruption into Griffin's perfect life is these postcards he starts receiving. These get increasingly threatening. And what Griffin realizes is that these are coming from a writer who is obviously very angry with him, violently so it appears, and a writer who he once scorned. And so late in the first act, Griffin becomes obsessed with finding out who this writer is because he wants this to stop. At first he's like, you know, just some sort of crazy person, but they're coming with increasing frequency, even to, in what I think is a wonderfully dated, but probably at the time seemed really fancy scene, the fax machine in his car. So he discovers that there's this writer named David Kahane, played wonderfully by Vincent D'Onofrio, whom he spurned several months earlier and who seemingly hates him. So he tracks Kahane down to Pasadena, where he lives with his girlfriend, played by Greta Scacchi in a wonderful role, June Goodman's daughter, who's a painter who never exhibits her stuff. And the production design of her paintings is one of the great things of the film, because it really gives us some insight into her character. In fact, she's often called sometimes the Ice Queen because of all the blues that she uses. And she tells Griffin, you know, David's at the film, he hates you, you're the dead man. And so he goes to the cinema in Pasadena, the Rialto, finds David watching Bicycle Thief, and they go out for drinks, and then they get into a scuffle afterwards. Griffin actually doesn't go there with the intention to do any harm. He wants these postcards to stop. He wants these threats to stop. And he makes Kahane an offer, but Griffin's kind of a phony. That's an important part of the film. Tim Robbins plays him with a kind of panache and confidence, the unrelenting drive of a successful white man in Hollywood. And Kahane sees through him, though. All right, you're not going to give me any of the stuff you promised. You came here to talk about my script, and you haven't even read my script. So he storms off. And at this point, Griffin's just bummed out, but they meet each other outside. They get into a scuffle, and Kahane pushes Griffin.
I said, let's forget this.
And then this happens.
Bill, you okay?
Keep it to yourself! Keep it to yourself! Keep it to yourself!
So here is the first turn, or the first twist of the film. Griffin has just murdered this writer. And this is where the thriller component of the film sort of doubles down, because for Act 1, which leads up to this moment, we're kind of like, who's doing this and why are they doing it? But now it's turned into a totally different film. He's killed the writer. And the rest of the film will be about two things, really, but many things. Griffin trying not to get caught, and Griffin deciding that he has to woo Kahane's girlfriend, like whatever the widow version of a girlfriend is, June. And their growing relationship as he pushes Bonnie, his once true love, to the side. Meanwhile, Larry Levy is trying harder and harder to sort of worm his way into the good graces of the studio so that he can take Griffin's job. So Griffin's got to hold off the police, he's got to hold off Levy, and he's got to woo this woman. And in all of these things, he acts somewhat reprehensibly. So why would we care? Let's talk a little bit about Griffin. Griffin is not a good guy. Griffin is the guy in The Day of the Locust who would have taken Faye home and bedded her and then never called her again. Griffin is the guy in Sunset Boulevard who would have kept stringing Joe along but never made his movie. Griffin is not a good person. And we find that out in lots of little ways through his interactions with some of the real Hollywood people he meets, like this wonderful short little scene with Malcolm McDowell.
Griffin? Griffin.
Malcolm McDowell.
Hi, how are you?
Just here.
Listen, the next time you want to badmouth me, have the courage to do it to my face. You guys are all the same.
So he has power. He has immense power. It's precarious internally, but externally he has immense power, but he's not respected. He's not really well liked. He's part of the problem of turning Hollywood into a money machine instead of an art machine. But he's also the protagonist of the film. So how does the film get away with having this murderer, adulterer, schemer be somebody that we kind of hope will get away with it? It does it in a couple of ways. First of all, the postcards. So before we really get a handle on Griffin's character, he starts getting threats, right? So in filmmaking and screenwriting, that kind of writing creates empathy between us and the protagonist. So we don't yet know the depths that Griffin can sort of go to. We don't know how cruel he can be, how awful he can be yet. We will find out. And the film's creating empathy with him because we're seeing that there's this guy who, he seems nice enough. He's hearing these pitches. He's got this wonderful girlfriend. They seem to be into each other. And so it hasn't shown us anything off the bat incredibly negative about him. And he's being threatened by some unseen, you know, danger. That's naturally going to create empathy. The other thing is Larry Levy, played wonderfully by Peter Gallagher. And Larry Levy, he's kind of a cipher in the film. He's not a fully realized character. In a lot of ways, he's kind of a joke character. He's the one who perhaps most sort of embodies what Altman hates about 1990 Hollywood. Probably based a little bit on somebody like Peter Guber. And by the way, if you want to read more about what sort of really happened around this time and the Hollywood that Altman's making fun of, this is a great book, Hit and Run, by Nancy Griffith and Kim Masters. It came out a couple of years after The Player, but it's about the Peter Guber and John Peters takeover of Columbia Pictures and the sort of monetizing of Hollywood. It's a fascinating read. It's a really good book. And it complements The Player really well. Anyhow, Levy's this guy who, well, he's a guy who thinks this.
I was just saying that I've yet to meet a writer who could change water into wine, and we have a tendency to treat them like that.
Not at this studio.
Million and a half of these scripts. It's nuts. And I think avoidable. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you actually bought a ticket to see a movie? You actually paid your own money to see it?
Pasadena, the bicycle thief.
You went to see The Bicycle Thief?
I love that film. It's a great film.
Yeah, it's art movie. It doesn't count. We're talking about movies.
Jesus, people.
But all I'm saying is I think there's a lot of time and money to be saved if we came up with these stories on our own.
Right, so even though we've seen by this point in the film Griffin saying things like, oh, it needs a happy ending. Oh, there's got to be some violence. There's got to be some sex. So Griffin definitely represents the Hollywood that Altman is kind of satirizing. But Levy's like times 10. Levy's that Hollywood on steroids. Let's just get rid of the writers, you know. And so by setting him up as bad Hollywood, the film also pulls a trick of making Griffin seem not so bad. So we have this guy who, yeah, he's a player in early 90s Hollywood. He's part of this problem, but he's not the worst part. He's not the Larry Levy's of the world, right? He's still interested in potentially good films. It's Levy who's the bad guy, right? And that's what I mean by a cipher. We never learn much about Levy beyond the fact that he's kind of a mover, shaker, fast-talking kiss-ass. And he's easy to dislike. So you couple that with the threatening postcards, and all of a sudden we have a protagonist now with whom we can sympathize. We have a protagonist that we might care a little bit about. And we see the stress he's driven to. We see the anxiety that both of these things create in him. And so when he finally commits the murder, it doesn't seem at first like some cold-blooded, premeditated, evil act. It seems like the response of a desperate man who's in over his head. And Hollywood gives us this story all the time. And I don't mean to say that his murder of Kahane is a good thing. What I mean to say is the movie very successfully positions that murder as understandable, particularly in that Kahane strikes first. So once we get into the film where the police, Whoopi Goldberg and later Lyle Lovett, are investigating Griffin, hot on his trail, it kind of creates a situation where we want Griffin to win. And that's part of the darkness of this film, is that it gets us to empathize with the true object of Altman's scorn. These Teflon, untouchable mofos who get away with murder. Earlier I mentioned talking a little bit about the production design and cinematography and the editing and how they add to this. They do so in a lot of ways. First of all, the production design is just great because if you actually pay attention to like Griffin's office and everything that's happening in the production offices, by populating the offices with busy people running around, with competent, sympathetic secretaries and assistants, first ADs running all over the place, movie paraphernalia everywhere, it feels like a studio lot. And this is a very low budget film, and Altman had to work with what he had, and a lot of the actors who performed in it did it for scale because they wanted to help Altman out. So they had to make these small spaces, these confined spaces, look, as they're flashing by, like the offices and the studio lot of you know, a big Hollywood studio, and the production design does that really well. The production design also does clever things, like you'll see a poster for M, this great Fritz Lang film, but if you look closely, it's actually the remake. That's how the production design tells us something about Griffin. Oh, oh, there's a superficiality or a shallowness to him that is only observable sort of if you pay close attention, right? And this runs throughout the film in lots of different ways. The cinematography is fascinating. I said before it's sort of voyeuristic, and that starts with that famous opening long take. This opening long take is celebrated for its length and its choreography, as it should be. It's fantastic, and I don't have time to show the whole thing here, but I'll show you a couple snippets. It starts like this.
Quiet on the set.
Okay, everybody, quiet on the set.
Scene 1, take 10, marker.
And action.
Joe Levison's office.
That is actually the take for the film, and I think I read they did 13 takes, and this is take 10 maybe. This was the best one. And as the camera moves around the lot, we're going to have Fred Ward's head of security constantly talking about long takes and how everything today is cut, 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 and it's MTV. And he keeps talking about the opening scene of Touch of Evil, but every time somebody brings up a different famous long take, he doesn't know it.
Hey, what about Absolute Beginners, man? That was an extraordinary shot.
What the hell was that? Never heard of it.
It's Julian Temple.
Good. We shot the whole thing without cuts. I hate all this cut.
Oh, yeah? Well, what about Bertolucci, that great track he shot with Winger in Sheltering Sky?
I didn't see it.
So it's very funny because on the one hand, he's meant to be this sort of repository of old Hollywood. Remember how they used to do it? But he doesn't actually know a lot. And that's the kind of superficiality that the film is taking the piss out of. But then, what does this scene do? It shows us the day-to-day workings of a studio lot, but it does so by zoning in on people's conversations, including several times coming up to windows and peering through the windows. So it's creating a sense of peeping Tomery or surveillance, which is subtly sort of reinforced by the fact that we keep returning to Fred Ward, who's the head of security, who throughout the film we'll discover kind of knows everything that's going on, as if he is surveying the entire lot, but also perhaps the private lives of all the people who work there. And then we get scenes like this one, where Griffin calls David's house because he's trying to find him before they meet, and he gets June on the phone, and then he watches her. He's almost stalking her, and the cinematography reinforces this, both in the way it shoots her from his point of view, but then shoots him as this kind of stalker outside the window whom she can't see. And there are lots of shots like this. Throughout Act 2 of the film, Lyle Lovett is going to pop up all over the place. And we don't know who he is at first. He could be somebody who knows about what Griffin did. He could be a police officer, which he turns out to be. But there are lots of scenes sort of that might be or might not be from his point of view, but scenes that feel like we're watching Griffin, where we're sort of spying. And the cinematography creates this mild kind of low-level anxiety, which I think is an important part of the empathy or the sympathy that we feel with Griffin, right? Because we get this sense of being watched, which is how he feels. So that aligns us with him in sort of subtle and really understated ways. And then we get great moments of editing like this one.
Shouldn't you talk to somebody about this?
What?
These postcards, you've gotten 5 in 2 weeks.
The way that we get that postcard cut to the dark, but it's not dark, it's the drawer and it's open full of more postcards, is a wonderful storytelling device, right? It's an edit that almost calls attention to itself, but so much information is presented in that moment and in that cut. And the film is full of cuts like this, where we get an unexpected, it's not a jump cut, but it's kind of a hard cut from the end of one scene to the beginning of the next. And in the sort of relationship between the two shots that we're seeing, we get more information. All of these elements are pushing the narrative one way, pushing the characters another way, commenting on the story, broadening the story, and creating this sense of this is a place where nasty things happen. Everybody's in everybody's business. Everybody's paying attention to everybody else, eavesdropping on conversations, trying to figure out who knows what, not just about the murder, but about the Larry Levy deal, about who's available for this film, about what's the next film that's going to be made, who's running the studio. All of this stuff is always the subject of conversations, of eavesdropping, and the film, through its cinematography, production design, editing, and performances, and script, all work together to create this vibe. The film, of course, is also a comedy. It's incredibly funny. It's got these little throwaway jokes. One of my favorite ones is this.
Rebecca De Mornay. Actually, you're much better looking.
No, I'm not Rebecca De
Jed
Mornay.
Ringer.
Thank you very much.
Do you know where Joel Levinson's office is?
I just like the way she's like, oh, thank you, instead of sort of being insulted, like, oh, I'm my own person. She's flattered. It's got dark comedy. There's a scene where Griffin's talking to June about having read David's script, and she says this.
You never read it.
Nope. I don't like reading.
Do you like books?
I like words and letters. I'm not crazy about complete sentences. So what did you think?
I love this moment because this is supposed to be her being kind of deep or an artist or in touch with, you know, a deeper understanding of life and all this stuff. I don't have time to read all this kind of stuff. I like letters and words, but once they get into sentences, they're too long. And you're like, oh, wow, she's deep. Wait a second. This is almost exactly the same thing that Larry Levy says when he's like, let's get rid of the writers. And I think it's a wonderful, darkly comic moment to have the love, the sort of the object of desire for Griffin, who's supposed to be this deep, thoughtful painter, basically saying the same thing. And it's kind of a way that the film says that everybody in Hollywood is a little bit daft. And that's not a new joke, but I think it's kind of fresh in the way it's presented here, not as a joke, but very clearly, darkly and twistedly humorous. Another one of my favorite throwaway jokes is this one with Larry Levy, where he's talking on the phone, his car phone, with Griffin about a pitch that Griffin wants to sort of offload onto Levy in the hopes that it'll fail.
Yeah, I'll get Levison. When can you be back?
I'll be there right after my AA meeting.
Oh, Larry. I didn't realize you had a drinking problem.
Well, I don't really, but that's where all the deals are being made these days. See ya.
That's like such an early 90s joke, but it's so, maybe it still flies today. I don't know. Let me know in the comments, but it's so funny, you know. That's where all the deals happen. It's great. Also, and then also there's the fascinating way that the film is about film, about the film industry, about watching movies, about making movies. And so we get scenes of red carpet premieres. We get scenes of Hollywood galas. we get scenes of films being made. And I love this moment because the cinematography and the editing do something very clever. We cut in on Scott Glenn and Lily Tomlin, and it looks very clearly like they're actually shooting this scene as we're watching.
Now. Action!
No, goddammit, Peterson, you listen to me. I've been around a while. I got a nose. This situation stinks. It stinks of the company. That's right, Peterson, the fucking CIA. You ever heard of it?
Willie understands what I'm talking
It's just the
about.
kind of...
And then we cut to the audience, and they're watching the same scene, but it feels very much like they're watching the dailies, which would be, you know, several hours later, because normally you wouldn't have a whole production crew like that on the set watching the film as it's getting made, because they don't want to sit there and look through take after take after take. They want to see the rushes as they're presented and how's the movie coming along. And it cuts back and forth, and it's this kind of, maybe meta is too strong, but this sort of self-reflexive moment of, you know, examining the film getting made and the film being watched. And of course, they're talking through it the whole time.
It's just the kind of operation those whiz-kid fucks.
You just don't understand what he's trying to go for here.
I guess I
find it
don't.
hard to listen to your argument when you don't even understand what he's going for.
Would you shut up, please?
If anybody else knows what he's going for, because you can't even see anything.
I have to cut because my robe caught on the drawer here. I couldn't help it.
I like this guy.
Scotty Glenn? He's great.
Water.
He's a cowboy. He's an FBI priest.
Have some Volvic, please.
No, goddamn.
The police came to see you about this dead writer.
We also get scenes of pitches, and there are tons of pitches throughout the film. That's Griffin's job, after all. And one of the great running jokes of the film is this pitch.
We open outside the largest penitentiary in California. It's night. It's raining. A limousine comes in through the front gate, past a tight knot of demonstrators holding a candlelight vigil. The candles under the umbrellas make them glow like Japanese lanterns.
It's nice. I haven't seen that before. That's good.
A lone demonstrator, a black woman, steps in front of the limousine. The lights illuminate her like a spirit. Her eyes fix upon those of the sole passenger. The moment is devastating between them.
He's the DA. She's the mother of the person that's being executed.
You're good. See, I told you.
So Dean Stockwell and Richard E. Grant, and they're fantastic. I love Richard E. Grant in this. They play this, it seems like Stockwell's his agent and Grant is this screenwriter, and they've got this idea for this sort of not American movie. This kind of death row movie about injustice, and they keep pitching it throughout the film, and one of the running jokes is how the pitch and then the film, we see the film being made or the rushes of the film near the end, how it changes, how the system turns Richard E. Grant's vision from one thing to another. And that whole process is very comedic throughout. But also Grant, the writer, you know, the serious, important writer, his response to it is comedic throughout as well. And he plays this sort of minor role fantastically. Richard E. Grant, thumbs up every time. There's so much more going on in this film. It's kind of like when you watched Arrested Development, which was 10 years later than this, and you could freeze frame every scene, or you could rewind and watch every scene and catch a new joke each time. Jokes are dropped like this, like that. There's visual jokes, there's dialogue jokes, a lot of Hollywood insider jokes, and you might find yourself like freezing it, listening again, looking up, who is Kastner? You know, looking them up. And every time you do that, the jokes deepen, and the realism of the film's world kind of broadens and deepens at the same time. But what it's really doing, and what makes it so effective, is that it's painting an incredibly bleak picture of Hollywood from the inside. When I talked about The Day of the Locust and when I talked about Sunset Boulevard, I talked about how Hollywood eats people up and spits them out. David Gahane is that person. And in The Day of the Locust or Sunset Boulevard, David Gahane would have been the protagonist. He would have been floating at the pool at the end. It would have been his story. But what the player does is it takes the eaters and the spitters and it makes it their story. And it does so by wrapping it in a very entertaining package. This is an incredibly well-made movie. You should definitely watch it. It's so fun to watch. It's breezy, it's fast, there's some cool sex scenes. One particularly famous sex scene that's shot between Robbins and Scacchi, almost entirely close-up from the shoulders up in this sweaty spa. It's fantastic and erotic and very kind of intimate and beautifully done. Beautiful deadpan comedy. Lyle Lovett's super funny. Whoopi Goldberg's super funny in it. And as it's doing all those things and you're like, yeah, this is great, what it's basically showing you though is how this kind of movie is so hard to make is because the people who are the stars or the protagonists of this film don't want to make this kind of movie. They are the bad guys. And it gets you caught up in this sort of embroiled, tenuous, emotional and empathetic relationship with the bad guys, which kind of is Altman saying something about Hollywood audiences too, I think. So I'll leave you to think about that, you know, like what role do audiences play in perpetuating the kind of Hollywood that Altman is trying to peel back the cover on here. More time. Thanks for watching, everybody. With that, I'll wrap up my sort of mini-series on the seedy side of Hollywood. I'll be moving on to something else, which if you've followed along, you know what's coming next, but it's going to be fun. And I'll just say, if you've made it this far, as I usually do, please like, please subscribe, please share this with your friends. I'm coming up on 1,000 subscribers, which is not a lot in the YouTube universe, but for long-form videos like this, 30, 40, sometimes 50 minutes, I'm kind of excited about that. So thanks to you all who have subscribed. If you haven't, please do. Help me hit that 1,000 subscriber mark. And I'll see you next time. Until then, I'm Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.